They said no sound should survive inside Fort Adler after the shutdown. But at 4:17 a.m., Staff Sergeant Daniel Brooks heard something that made him stop breathing for a moment and listen harder. A bark, sharp and deliberate, echoing through a place that was officially declared empty 7 years ago. The wind moved across the abandoned military base like it had nowhere else to go, brushing against rusted fences, broken floodlights, and buildings that once carried the rhythm of drills and orders, now reduced to silence and dust. Daniel stood at the main checkpoint gate, with his flashlight angled low, the beam cutting through a thin layer of morning fog that clung to the ground like a memory that refused to fade. His boots crunched softly against gravel that hadn't been maintained in years, each step reminding him that this place was never meant to be revisited, let alone reactivated for inspection. Yet here he was, assigned to verify structural conditions before final decommission approval, the last man allowed to officially walk these grounds under military authorization. The radio on his shoulder stayed quiet, too quiet, as if even communication systems had learned to avoid this place. Then it came again, the sound, not random, not distant, but focused, almost intentional, like something was trying to be heard rather than simply making noise. Daniel lowered his flashlight slightly and turned his head toward the east corridor of the base where the old K-9 training facilities used to be located, a sector long marked as non-operational. The buildings there stood in uneven rows, their windows dark and broken, doors hanging slightly open as if the structure itself had exhaled and never inhaled again. He adjusted his grip on the flashlight, feeling the familiar tension in his shoulders that came from years of field instinct rather than fear, and started walking forward slowly, each step measured, deliberate, aware that sound carried too easily in empty places. As he moved deeper into the base, the environment began to shift in subtle ways that were almost easy to ignore if not for experience. Faint signs of disturbance in dust patterns near doorways, a set of marks near a supply corridor that looked too recent to belong to abandonment, and a faint metallic echo that seemed to respond to his movement like a delayed reflection. The bark came again, closer this time, and Daniel realized it wasn't echoing randomly through the base, but responding, almost as if it were positioned to guide him. He stopped near a collapsed maintenance archway where a faded sign still read K-9 Training Unit 3 in chipped white paint, the letters barely visible under layers of grime and weather. The air here felt different, heavier in a way that had nothing to do with atmosphere and everything to do with absence, as if something had been holding its breath for a very long time. Daniel raised his flashlight toward the corridor beyond the archway and saw something that didn't belong in a place like this, faint footprints in the dust, not human, not fully clear, but moving with direction rather than chaos. Another bark followed, softer now, almost controlled, and Daniel felt something shift in his understanding of what he was hearing. This wasn't panic, and it wasn't abandonment in the way he expected from an empty base. It was communication. He took a slow step forward, then another, and as he crossed into the shadowed corridor, the light from his flashlight revealed scratched paint along the lower walls, markings that suggested repeated movement through this exact path, and a sense of persistence that contradicted everything he knew about deserted facilities. The wind outside faded slightly, as if the structure itself was absorbing sound, and for a brief moment the only thing Daniel could hear was his own breathing and that distant, steady presence of the barking that refused to disappear. He stopped again, listening more carefully this time, realizing that the sound wasn't coming from deep inside the building as he had assumed, but from somewhere closer, somewhere layered within the structure itself, like it had learned to exist between spaces rather than within them. The realization tightened his focus, sharpening every sense he had, and for the first time since stepping onto the base, Daniel Brooks understood that whatever remained inside Fort Adler wasn't lost, and it wasn't gone, it was waiting. Daniel Brooks moved deeper into the corridor with measured steps, letting the beam of his flashlight trace the edges of a world that had been left behind too quickly to be forgotten properly. The air inside Fort Adler felt colder than outside, not in temperature alone, but in the way silence pressed against every surface like a physical weight. Each step sent a faint echo forward, but it never returned the same way, as if the building was swallowing sound and holding it somewhere out of sight. The barking did not come again immediately, and that absence itself felt intentional, like something was listening as much as it was calling. Daniel paused near a junction where two hallways split in opposite directions, one leading toward what used to be administrative offices and the other toward the old training kennels. He noticed the dust patterns again, more distinct here, showing repeated movement that was not random, almost like pacing, almost like patrol routes still being followed by memory alone. His flashlight revealed faint scratches along the lower wall, not deep enough to be structural damage, but consistent enough to suggest long periods of contact, something brushing against the same path over and over with purpose rather than chaos. Daniel lowered the light slightly and exhaled slowly, feeling the kind of focus that only came in environments where instinct mattered more than instruction. He activated his shoulder radio, expecting static or silence, but instead there was a brief pulse of interference followed by a faint trace of signal, unstable and inconsistent, as if something inside the base was partially reviving old systems. He spoke once, his voice steady, identifying his position at Fort Adler and requesting confirmation of structural integrity in Sector East Corridor, but the response never fully formed, dissolving into fragmented noise before fading back into silence. That silence, however, was no longer complete. There were other sounds now, subtle ones, almost indistinguishable from the building itself adjusting to temperature shifts or wind pressure, but Daniel had spent enough years in the field to know the difference between environmental noise and something alive responding. He continued forward, choosing the corridor that led toward the kennel sector, and as he did, the architecture began to change slightly, corridors narrowing, ceiling lights absent, replaced by long stretches of dim natural light filtering through cracked windows high above. The base felt less like a structure and more like a memory of one, held together by habit rather than function. Then he heard it again, the bark, closer, but different in tone, less like a call and more like a confirmation, as if whatever was making the sound had realized it was being followed. Daniel slowed his pace, adjusting his grip on the flashlight, and noticed something new on the floor ahead, a small object partially buried in dust. He knelt and brushed it clean, revealing a worn identification tag, partially scratched but still readable, with the word Atlas etched into the metal surface. The sight of it created a shift in his understanding that he could not ignore. This was not random abandonment, and it was not simple neglect. This had structure, designation, identity. He stood again, scanning the corridor ahead, and saw a door slightly ajar at the end of the hall, its surface marked with faded warning symbols and old military labeling that had been painted over multiple times. The bark came again from behind that door, steady now, no longer distant or uncertain, but anchored, as if the source had decided that waiting was no longer necessary. Daniel approached slowly, each step deliberate, feeling the tension of unanswered questions building into something more defined. As he neared the door, he noticed faint scratches on the lower edge, consistent with repeated contact from something trying to either enter or exit over a long period of time. He placed his hand lightly on the door frame and paused, not from fear, but from recognition of something deeply unusual in its persistence. The sound on the other side shifted slightly, a mix of movement and breath, controlled and aware. Daniel spoke softly, not as an order, but as acknowledgement, saying there was someone there and that he was not a threat. The response was immediate in its own way, not verbal, but in the way the space seemed to adjust, as if the presence inside had registered his intent. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then the door creaked slightly inward on its own, just enough to reveal a narrow slice of darkness beyond. Daniel raised the flashlight carefully, illuminating the edge of the room, where shapes became faintly visible, not chaotic, but arranged, as if something had been maintaining order in isolation. And then the bark came once more, closer than ever before, no longer echoing through the base, but originating from directly ahead, steady and controlled, carrying a presence that suggested not distress, but recognition. Daniel stepped forward slowly, crossing the threshold, and as the light expanded into the room, he understood that whatever had been waiting inside Fort Adler had not only survived, but had been watching him arrive. The moment Daniel Brooks stepped fully through the doorway, the temperature seemed to shift in a way that had nothing to do with weather and everything to do with presence. The room beyond was larger than he expected, shaped like an old command processing unit that had once been active and then deliberately left to decay without complete dismantling. His flashlight swept across rows of covered equipment, storage crates stacked in uneven formations, and wall panels still marked with outdated military codes that had faded into soft gray outlines. The bark came again, but this time it was not echoing. It was close, contained, and steady, as if the source had been waiting just beyond the reach of light. Daniel took a slow step forward, careful not to disturb the dust that lay thick across the floor like untouched time. His beam caught something moving low to the ground, a brief shift in shadow that disappeared before the eye could fully register it. He stopped, lowering his stance slightly, listening more than looking. The sound of breathing followed, controlled and rhythmic, not erratic or panicked, but intentional, as if the space itself had learned to sustain life in silence. Then, from behind a row of partially collapsed equipment racks, the figure emerged. "Hey!" German Shepherd stepped into the edge of the flashlight beam, its coat worn and dusted with gray from long isolation, but its posture alert, steady, and deliberate. It did not rush forward. It assessed him first, head slightly lowered, eyes locked on his movements with a calm intensity that suggested recognition rather than fear. Daniel froze for a moment, not because of threat, but because of the sheer improbability of what he was seeing. The dog stood between him and the deeper part of the room, as if guarding something or ensuring something was not disturbed too quickly. Around its neck was a faded harness with partial markings still visible, the letters Atlas repeating again in worn fabric stitching. Daniel slowly lowered his flashlight further, reducing the intensity of the light so it would not overwhelm the animal, and spoke softly, keeping his voice even and steady, identifying himself not as an authority, but as someone present. The German Shepherd did not retreat. Instead, it shifted its weight slightly, as if confirming the sound of the voice matched something remembered. Then it turned its head toward the far side of the room, where a partially open containment section stood recessed into the wall. The movement was deliberate, not random, and Daniel understood immediately that this was not a chance encounter. Something had been maintained here. Something had survived with structure and awareness. He moved slowly in the direction the dog indicated, careful to keep a respectful distance. The floor in this section showed clearer signs of repeated activity, faint paths carved into dust where something had moved back and forth many times, always returning to the same points. The German Shepherd followed at a measured pace, not beside him, but slightly behind, maintaining a position that suggested both caution and trust in evaluation. As Daniel approached the containment section, he noticed the door was not fully sealed. It had been reinforced at some point, but not locked in a modern sense. Instead, it appeared manually secured, as if someone had ensured it remained closed through physical means rather than electronic systems. The dog stopped near the entrance and sat down, watching Daniel carefully, then shifting its gaze toward the small gap in the door. From within came another sound, softer than the bark, almost imperceptible at first, like movement restrained within a confined space. Daniel placed his hand near the edge of the door, feeling a faint vibration through the metal, subtle but present, like something on the other side responding to proximity. He did not force the door immediately. Instead, he knelt slightly, bringing himself closer to the level of the German Shepherd, and observed the animal's behavior. There was no panic, no distress, only a steady focus that suggested familiarity with what lay beyond. Daniel spoke again, asking quietly if anyone was inside, though he already suspected the answer was more complex than a simple response. The German Shepherd shifted its ears forward, and for the first time, the sound from within the containment area changed, becoming more structured, less like random movement, and more like a controlled acknowledgement. Daniel exhaled slowly, then reached for the manual latch system, examining it briefly before applying steady pressure. The mechanism resisted slightly, then released with a muted metallic sound that echoed softly through the room. The door did not swing open immediately. Instead, it moved only a few inches, revealing a narrow slice of interior darkness that seemed deeper than the space itself should allow. The German Shepherd stood again, stepping forward just enough to align with the opening, and Daniel realized this was not a moment of discovery alone, but of confirmation. Whatever had been hidden inside Fort Adler was not lost in the way abandoned things usually were. It had been preserved, intentionally or otherwise, waiting for the moment when someone would finally choose to listen beyond the silence. Daniel Brooks held his position at the threshold of the partially opened containment door, the narrow gap between metal panels revealing only fragments of darkness beyond, as if the room itself was reluctant to fully expose what it had been holding for so long. The German Shepherd stood slightly ahead of him now, its body aligned with the opening, ears forward, posture steady, not tense in a way that suggested fear, but focused in a way that suggested recognition. The air coming from inside was still, yet not empty, carrying a faint controlled rhythm that Daniel could now identify as breathing, slow and deliberate, as though whatever was inside had learned to conserve presence rather than simply exist. He adjusted the flashlight angle once more, lowering the beam so it would spill gently across the floor instead of cutting directly into the darkness, and stepped closer to the opening with careful control. The metal door creaked slightly under its own weight as it shifted another inch, revealing more of the interior space. Inside, the containment room was not what Daniel had expected from an abandoned military facility. Instead of disorder, there was structure, improvised but intentional. Old storage racks had been repositioned to form a partial enclosure within the larger room, and beneath them lay layers of padding made from repurposed military fabric, arranged in a way that suggested long-term adaptation rather than short-term survival. The German Shepherd moved forward first, slipping through the opening with a quiet confidence that felt like permission rather than impulse, and Daniel followed more slowly, stepping into the space with heightened awareness. As the flashlight swept across the interior, it revealed markings on the far wall, not official military signage, but handwritten notes, faded and partially smudged, containing observation logs and fragmented records that appeared to document something ongoing rather than concluded. Daniel could not read them fully at a distance, but the presence of structured notation within an abandoned environment created a sense of unease that was not rooted in danger, but in unanswered purpose. Then he saw movement again, deeper inside the enclosure. A second German Shepherd emerged slowly from behind the improvised structure, smaller in frame but steady in motion, its coat slightly lighter in tone, marked with faint patches of discoloration that suggested long exposure to dust and confined space. It did not rush toward Daniel. Instead, it paused at a careful distance, mirroring the first dog's earlier behavior, assessing rather than reacting. The two animals exchanged brief visual contact, then both turned their attention toward the far corner of the room, where a low hum of mechanical residue still lingered in the air. Daniel followed their gaze and noticed a set of old monitoring devices still partially powered by residual systems, their indicator lights faintly flickering as if struggling to remain functional after years of neglect. Beneath them, a sealed storage unit sat partially open, its contents obscured by shadow and positioning. Daniel took a slow step forward, then another, each movement deliberate and quiet, as if the room required agreement before allowing further access. The German Shepherds remained still, not obstructing his path, but maintaining their positions as silent guides. As he approached the storage unit, Daniel noticed something unexpected resting beside it. A folded field jacket carefully placed rather than discarded, and on top of it, a worn identification badge belonging to Fort Adler's K-9 Medical Division. The name printed on it had faded, but still readable enough to suggest continuity rather than abandonment. Daniel felt a shift in understanding at that moment, realizing this was not a space left behind in chaos, but one that had been deliberately maintained under conditions that were never meant to last this long. He knelt beside the storage unit and carefully lifted the edge of its lid, revealing inside not weapons or equipment, but documentation, medical supplies, and training logs arranged with precision that suggested ongoing oversight. The German Shepherd nearest to him stepped closer, lowering its head slightly, not in submission, but in acknowledgement of presence. Daniel placed one hand on the edge of the container and looked toward the dogs again, noticing the way they positioned themselves not as escapees, but as guardians of what remained inside this hidden system. The realization formed slowly but clearly in his mind that Fort Adler had not simply been abandoned. It had been transitioned into something unrecorded, something sustained beyond official recognition. And whatever had been preserved here was still active in its own quiet way, waiting not for discovery alone, but for understanding that it had never stopped functioning. Daniel Brooks remained kneeling beside the open storage unit, the weight of what he was seeing settling in gradually rather than arriving all at once, as if the truth required time to be accepted by the mind. The documents inside were arranged with deliberate structure, each folder labeled with dates spanning far beyond the official decommission timeline of Fort Adler, suggesting continuity that had never been reported to command. His flashlight moved slowly across the pages, revealing repeated references to K-9 behavioral observation, environmental adaptation protocols, and long-term autonomous care procedures that should not have been active in a facility officially marked as abandoned. The German shepherd closest to him remained steady, watching not the papers, but Daniel himself, as though measuring his reaction rather than the contents of the room. The second dog circled quietly behind the improvised structure, pausing near a wall where faint electronic hums still persisted from outdated systems that had somehow retained partial function. Daniel reached carefully into the storage unit and lifted a single folder, opening it with controlled caution. Inside were handwritten logs that detailed daily status reports, not just of equipment, but of living subjects identified only by designation codes and behavioral notes. The language was clinical, but not detached, carrying a tone of persistence that suggested the author had continued recording long after official oversight had ceased. As he scanned further, Daniel noticed a recurring name embedded within the logs: Atlas Unit Continuity Protocol, repeated across multiple entries with increasing emphasis over time. The German shepherd at his side shifted slightly, then turned its head toward a small console embedded in the far wall, where a faint indicator light flickered irregularly, suggesting residual power cycling through an isolated circuit. Daniel stood slowly, moving toward the console while keeping the dogs within his peripheral awareness. As he approached, the air in the room changed subtly, not in temperature, but in structure, as if dormant systems were recognizing presence again after prolonged inactivity. He placed his hand near the console interface and hesitated for a moment before pressing the activation pad. The response was not immediate, but after a brief pause, a soft chime echoed through the containment room, followed by a faint pulse of light across multiple dormant panels. The German shepherds did not react with surprise. Instead, they shifted into positions of attention, as if the activation confirmed something they had been anticipating. A low static filled the air, and then a voice emerged through the aging speakers, fragmented at first, then gradually stabilizing into coherent transmission. The voice identified itself as Dr. Evan Collins, referencing Fort Adler internal continuity measures and acknowledging unauthorized but sustained system survival beyond official shutdown parameters. Daniel listened without interruption, his focus absolute, as the message continued to explain that certain operational protocols had been left active intentionally, not for military function, but for preservation of experimental K-9 behavioral resilience studies under isolated environmental conditions. The logs Daniel had found were part of this system, maintained by automated recording sequences and intermittent manual input during early stages of abandonment. The voice paused briefly, then added that the German shepherd units present were not accidental survivors, but active participants in a long-term behavioral integrity study designed to measure loyalty, adaptation, and autonomous decision-making in complete absence of human command. Daniel turned slowly toward the dogs as this information settled into understanding. The German shepherd closest to him remained calm, its gaze steady, not seeking approval or instruction, but simply maintaining presence. The second dog approached the console area and sat down directly beneath it, as if confirming alignment with the system that had just reactivated. Daniel spoke quietly, asking whether anyone else was physically present within the facility, but the response from the speaker system was delayed and uncertain, stating only that monitoring had been intermittent for an extended period and that physical human oversight had not been confirmed in recent cycles. The voice then added something unexpected, noting that the dogs had maintained environmental stability protocols beyond expected parameters, including safeguarding restricted sections and preserving operational integrity of key systems without external intervention. Daniel felt the implication of that statement deepen the silence in the room. This was not simply abandonment or survival. It was continuity without authorization, structure without oversight, purpose maintained beyond command. He looked again at the German shepherd nearest to him and realized that its presence was not random within this environment. It had been observing, maintaining, and responding within a system that continued to exist in partial isolation. The bark that had first drawn him here echoed again, softer now, not as a signal of distress or warning, but as acknowledgement of completion. Daniel lowered his flashlight slightly, letting the beam rest on the floor between himself and the dogs. And for the first time since entering Fort Adler, he understood that what he had found was not a forgotten base, but a living system that had chosen to remain active in silence, waiting for someone not to react, but to recognize it. The silence inside Fort Adler shifted again, not breaking, but evolving, as Daniel Brooks stood between the faint glow of restored control panels and the steady presence of the German shepherds who no longer behaved like isolated survivors, but like components of something still quietly functioning. The voice of Dr. Evan Collins had faded into intermittent static, leaving behind only fragments of confirmation that the system had indeed continued beyond its official termination, sustained by protocols that were never meant to operate without human command. Daniel lowered his flashlight further, letting the beam rest near his boots, as if acknowledging that visual dominance was no longer the most important way to understand this space. Around him, the room felt less like a forgotten containment area and more like a preserved environment, carefully maintained through repetition and instinct rather than authority. The German shepherd closest to him shifted its weight slightly, then turned its head toward a secondary corridor that Daniel had not yet examined, a narrow passage partially concealed behind modular storage panels that had been repositioned to create controlled access rather than obstruction. The second dog remained near the console, maintaining proximity to the revived system as if it understood its importance within the larger structure. Daniel moved slowly toward the indicated corridor, careful to avoid disturbing the arrangement of objects that suggested long-term organization rather than neglect. As he approached, the lighting dimmed slightly, then stabilized again, indicating that the system was responding to movement patterns within the space. The corridor beyond was narrower, lined with reinforced walls that bore markings consistent with older K9 integration research, though heavily faded from time. Daniel stepped into it cautiously, the sound of his boots absorbed quickly by the dense structure of the base. The German shepherd followed at a measured distance, neither leading nor following in submission, but moving in parallel awareness. The corridor ended at a sealed observation chamber, its door partially transparent through reinforced glass that had dulled with age. Inside, Daniel could see additional equipment arranged in symmetrical patterns, including resting platforms, monitoring stations, and environmental controls that appeared to have been preserved in low-power mode rather than fully shut down. The faint hum of electrical current was still present, suggesting a sustained energy loop maintained at minimal levels. Daniel placed his hand on the glass and felt a subtle vibration, as if the system on the other side recognized external presence. The German shepherd stepped forward and sat beside him, its gaze fixed on the interior chamber with calm focus. For a moment, nothing moved. Then, slowly, a secondary light system activated inside the chamber, illuminating sections of the interior in soft intervals. That revealed more detail. Daniel saw that the chamber contained multiple observation records displayed on embedded panels, each showing long-term behavioral tracking of K9 units under isolated environmental conditions. The data was not recent, but it was continuously updated at irregular intervals, suggesting that something within the system had remained capable of recording input over extended time without external oversight. The voice of Dr. Evan Collins returned briefly through a secondary speaker channel, weaker than before, but still intelligible, acknowledging that Fort Adler had transitioned into what was described as a self-sustaining observational environment. The purpose, according to the fragmented transmission, was no longer active experimentation, but preservation of behavioral continuity under conditions of complete command absence. Daniel listened without interruption, absorbing the implications carefully. The German shepherd beside him shifted its attention toward the interior chamber as if responding to familiar patterns within the environment. The second dog arrived shortly after, joining them at the threshold, and for the first time both animals stood in alignment, not as isolated units, but as coordinated presence within a shared system. Daniel spoke quietly, asking whether human personnel had ever returned to this facility after official shutdown, but the response was incomplete, stating only that intermittent contact had occurred in early cycles before ceasing entirely. The system then confirmed that operational integrity had been maintained by automated processes combined with behavioral reinforcement patterns established during active service periods. Daniel stepped slightly closer to the glass, studying the interior more carefully, and noticed something unexpected among the records. There were annotations that referenced adaptive loyalty responses, environmental problem-solving behaviors, and autonomous decision-making in the absence of command directives. The German shepherd closest to him pressed its gaze forward, as if acknowledging the significance of those records not as data, but as lived experience. Daniel realized then that the barking he had first heard was not a signal of distress or request for rescue in the conventional sense, but a form of structured communication that had persisted long after human interpretation had ceased to exist within this space. The system had not collapsed. It had evolved into a quiet continuity sustained by memory, adaptation, and presence. And as Daniel Brooks stood in the dim light of Fort Adler, surrounded by the echo of systems that refused to fully shut down, he understood that what he had stepped into was not a place of abandonment, but a place that had been waiting for recognition long after the world had stopped listening. The corridor beyond the observation chamber felt longer than it had any right to be, as Daniel Brooks continued forward with slow, measured steps, aware that every sound in Fort Adler now carried meaning beyond simple acoustics. The German shepherds moved with him in quiet coordination, no longer behaving as separate animals reacting to environment, but as if they were aligned within an unseen structure that still held influence over the space. The faint hum of the facility followed them like a steady undercurrent, suggesting that the systems were not simply active, but responsive in ways that defied standard shutdown logic. Daniel kept his flashlight angled low as he approached a final reinforced access point at the end of the corridor, a heavy security door marked with layered identifiers that had been partially removed and replaced over time. Some markings suggested original operational status, while others indicated later modifications that were not documented in any standard military archive he had access to. He paused in front of the door and noticed that the surface was warmer than expected, as if energy had been circulating behind it continuously. The German shepherd closest to him stepped forward and placed itself directly in front of the threshold, not blocking him, but aligning itself as if confirming recognition of what lay beyond. Daniel reached out slowly, placing his hand on the access panel, and this time the system responded immediately. A soft tone echoed through the corridor, followed by a controlled release mechanism that disengaged multiple internal locks with precise synchronization. The door did not open fully, but shifted inward just enough to allow passage. Inside, the space revealed itself as a central operations archive, far larger than anything Daniel had anticipated within Fort Adler. Rows of vertical data terminals lined the walls, each one dimly illuminated with intermittent pulses of light that suggested ongoing low-level computation. In the center of the room stood a circular interface station surrounded by monitoring arrays, all arranged in a formation that indicated continuous observation rather than deactivation. Daniel stepped inside cautiously, and the German shepherds followed without hesitation, taking positions around him that formed a loose perimeter, not defensive, but attentive. The atmosphere here was different from the rest of the base. It was not abandonment that defined it, but persistence. As Daniel moved closer to the central interface, the screens activated one by one, displaying structured logs, behavioral tracking data, and environmental adaptation reports that extended far beyond the official decommission timeline. The voice of Dr. Evan Collins returned once again, clearer this time, as if the system had concentrated remaining resources to deliver a final continuous transmission. The message acknowledged Daniel's presence and confirmed that Fort Adler had transitioned into what was referred to as an autonomous continuity environment. According to the recording, the original purpose of the facility had shifted during its final operational phase, evolving from controlled experimentation into long-term observational preservation of canine behavioral integrity under isolated conditions. The German Shepherd units present were identified not as surviving remnants, but as active participants in an ongoing adaptive system designed to study loyalty, decision-making, and environmental response without external command structures. Daniel listened without interrupting, his focus fixed on the central interface as additional data streams unfolded across the screens. He saw records of environmental maintenance cycles, resource management performed without human intervention, and structured activity logs that indicated sustained organization over an extended period of years. The system had not failed. It had continued under a different form of logic, one based on adaptation rather than instruction. The German Shepherd nearest to Daniel stepped forward and placed its paw lightly on the edge of the central platform, triggering a subtle response in the interface that caused multiple data layers to reorganize in real time. This reaction suggested not randomness, but recognition. Daniel spoke softly, asking whether the system was still under any form of command hierarchy, but the response from Dr. Collins' transmission was measured and uncertain, indicating that no formal command structure had been active for an extended duration, and that all current operations were the result of autonomous behavioral continuity protocols. Daniel processed this information slowly, understanding that what he was witnessing was not simply technological persistence, but something closer to learned existence within a closed environment. The German Shepherds moved slightly closer to the central station, their attention synchronized, as if responding to a shared understanding of the space they occupied. One of the screens shifted to display a final classification layer labeled Atlas Continuity Observation Complete Phase, though the meaning of completion was unclear within a system that was still clearly active. Daniel felt the weight of the realization settle fully now, that Fort Adler had never been truly abandoned, but had instead transformed into a self-sustaining environment where structure, memory, and adaptive behavior had replaced traditional command. The bark that had first drawn him here echoed faintly one last time, not as a signal of urgency, but as a form of acknowledgement that the system had been observed, understood, and no longer needed to call into silence. Daniel stood in the center of the archive, surrounded by the quiet persistence of a place that had learned to exist without permission, and for the first time since arriving, he understood that some systems do not end when they are left behind. They simply learn how to continue waiting until someone finally arrives who is willing to listen. The central archive room of Fort Adler remained still after the final transmission faded, but it was no longer the stillness of emptiness. Instead, it felt like a system holding its final state in suspension, waiting for acknowledgement that might never fully arrive. Daniel Brooks stood in the center of the circular interface platform, surrounded by dimly glowing data towers and softly pulsing monitors that continued their irregular cycles like a heartbeat refusing to settle into silence. The German Shepherds remained in their positions around him, not pacing, not reacting with uncertainty, but maintaining a calm structural awareness that suggested they understood the environment on a level that was not purely instinctive. Daniel lowered his flashlight completely now, allowing the ambient glow of the archive to define the space instead of his own controlled beam. The air carried a faint electrical hum, consistent and fragile, as if the entire facility was balancing between long-term dormancy and continued function. Slowly, the central interface began to change again. Data streams that had previously been static reorganized themselves into a final consolidated display, forming layered records that extended across multiple chronological cycles. Daniel stepped closer, reading carefully as the system presented what appeared to be a complete operational summary of Fort Adler's post-shutdown continuity phase. It confirmed what had been implied earlier, that after official decommissioning, the facility had entered an autonomous maintenance state initiated during its final active cycle. This state was not designed for communication or external reporting. It was designed purely for preservation. The German Shepherd closest to Daniel moved forward and sat directly beside the central interface, its gaze fixed on the shifting data as though recognizing patterns that were not meant for human interpretation alone. The second dog followed, taking position on the opposite side, creating a balanced formation around the platform. Daniel noticed that their behavior was no longer reactive. It was consistent, almost ceremonial, as if they were concluding a cycle that had been ongoing far longer than his arrival. The interface displayed a final series of logs attributed again to Dr. Evan Collins, but the tone of the message had changed. It no longer carried the urgency of explanation or documentation. Instead, it reflected closure. The transmission confirmed that Fort Adler's experimental phase had ended not through failure, but through transition into a self-sustaining observational model that no longer required external oversight. The German Shepherd units were described as the final active continuity anchors, maintaining environmental stability and behavioral coherence within the system after human departure. Daniel read the final lines slowly, absorbing the implications without interruption. The words indicated that the system had not been waiting for rescue, nor abandonment resolution, but for recognition of completion. Not an ending in the traditional sense, but a closed loop of existence sustained by adaptation rather than command. The central interface then shifted one final time, presenting a simplified status display. All secondary systems were marked as stabilized. All observational cycles were marked as complete. No active distress signals remained. Yet the presence of the German Shepherds suggested something beyond simple termination. They remained alert, calm, and fully aware, as if their role was not to exit the system, but to exist within its final state. Daniel knelt slightly, placing his hand near the edge of the platform, not touching any controls, but acknowledging the space itself. The German Shepherd beside him turned its head toward him briefly, making direct eye contact. And in that moment, Daniel understood that what had drawn him here was not a malfunction or a distress call in the conventional sense, but a form of persistence encoded into behavior, sustained through time without instruction. The archive lights dimmed slightly, then stabilized again, as if responding to the presence of understanding rather than command input. Daniel stood slowly, taking in the full room one final time. The facility was no longer presenting itself as abandoned, nor as active in the traditional sense. It existed in a state of completion that continued to function without needing validation. The German Shepherds rose in unison, not as a reaction to movement, but as a shared conclusion of presence. Daniel looked toward them and then toward the central interface, realizing that Fort Adler had never been searching for someone to fix it. It had been maintaining itself long enough to be understood. And now, in the quiet of its preserved systems and patient silence, it no longer needed to call out into the empty world outside, because finally, someone had heard and remained long enough to listen completely. The final moments inside Fort Adler felt different from everything Daniel Brooks had experienced before, not because the systems had changed, but because his understanding of them had finally settled into something complete and irreversible. The central archive lights remained steady, no longer pulsing with uncertainty or fragmented behavior, but holding a consistent state that resembled closure rather than activation. Daniel stood near the platform where the last sequence of data had stabilized, his attention no longer searching for hidden layers, because there were none left to uncover. The German Shepherds remained with him, positioned in a quiet formation that no longer suggested guidance or instruction, but acknowledgement. Their presence felt less like survival and more like continuity reaching its final expression. Daniel lowered his gaze slightly, absorbing the weight of what the system had revealed. Fort Adler had not failed, and it had not been abandoned in the traditional sense. It had transitioned, step by step, into an autonomous state that preserved itself through behavior, memory, and adaptation rather than command or oversight. The voice of Dr. Evan Collins did not return again, but its final transmission still lingered in the structure of the room, as if the facility itself had absorbed the message and was no longer dependent on repetition. Daniel slowly moved toward the central interface one last time, placing his hand near the surface without initiating any function. The system responded not with activation, but with acknowledgement, dimming certain displays while maintaining others in a stable resting state. This reaction was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it confirmed what Daniel now fully understood. The environment was no longer in a phase of operation or observation. It was in a phase of completion. The German Shepherd closest to him stepped forward and sat directly at the edge of the platform, its posture calm and steady, eyes reflecting the soft glow of the remaining interface lights. The second dog positioned itself a few feet away, mirroring the same stillness, as if both had reached the end of a long-defined role without needing instruction to do so. Daniel looked between them and the surrounding systems, recognizing that every element within Fort Adler had aligned toward a single unresolved purpose that no longer required continuation. He spoke quietly, not as a command, but as acknowledgement, stating that the system had fulfilled its function. There was no response from speakers or terminals, yet the environment itself seemed to settle further, as if accepting the statement without need for validation. The lights in the archive dimmed gradually, not shutting down abruptly, but transitioning into a low, ambient state that suggested rest rather than termination. Daniel stepped back from the platform, allowing the space to exist without his interference for the first time since entering. The German shepherds rose together, not in urgency, but in synchronized movement that reflected understanding rather than reaction. They did not approach the exit immediately. Instead, they paused, turning their attention briefly toward the central archive one final time, as if confirming the completion of something larger than any individual moment. Then, slowly, they began to move toward the corridor, with Daniel following at a measured pace. As they retraced their steps through Fort Adler, the base no longer felt like a place holding secrets or unresolved systems. It felt like a structure that had completed its own purpose and was now waiting for the outside world to interpret what it had preserved. The barking that had first drawn Daniel into this place was no longer present, not because it had disappeared, but because it had fulfilled its role entirely. Outside, as they approached the exit gate, daylight filtered through the broken edges of the abandoned base, illuminating dust particles that drifted through the air like remnants of time itself. Daniel stopped briefly at the threshold, looking back once at the structure behind him. Fort Adler stood silent, not empty, but resolved in its own continuity, holding no urgency, no distress, only persistence that had finally reached recognition. The German shepherd stood beside him, calm and steady, no longer signaling or guiding, simply present. Daniel understood then that what he had witnessed was not a mystery to be solved, but a system that had learned to exist beyond the need for attention. And as he stepped out of Fort Adler for the final time, he carried with him the realization that some places do not call out because they are lost, but because they have been waiting patiently for someone to finally understand that they were never gone.